Good evening and welcome back to another episode of The Longing, where today we are going to be continuing to read Dream Days by Kenneth Grahame. So, let's get going with that. Somewhat disheartened, I made my way downstairs and out into the sunlight, where I found Harold playing conspirators by himself on the gravel. He had dug a small hole in the walk and had laid an imaginary train of powder there too, and as he sought refuge in the laurels from the inevitable explosion, I heard him murmur, "My God," said the Tsar, "my plans are frustrated." It seemed an excellent occasion for being a black puma. Harold liked black pumas, on the whole, as well as any animal we were familiar with. So I launched myself on him, with the appropriate howl rolling him over on the gravel. Life may be said to be composed of things that come off and things that don't come off. This thing, unfortunately, was one of the things that didn't come off. From beneath me I heard a shrill cry of, "Oh, it's my sore knee," and Harold wriggled himself free from the puma's clutches, bellowing dismally. Now I honestly didn't know he had a sore knee, and what's more, he knew I didn't know he had a sore knee. According to boy ethics, therefore, his attitude was wrong, sore knee or not, and no apology was due from me. I made halfway advances, however, suggesting we should lie in ambush by the edge of the pond and cut off the ducks as they waddled down in simple, unsuspecting single file, then hunt them as bisons flying scattered over the vast prairie. A fascinating pursuit this, and strictly illicit, but Harold would none of my overtures, and retreated to the house wailing with full lungs. Things were getting simply infernal. I struck out blindly for the open country, and even as I made for the gate a shrill voice from a window bade me keep off the flower beds. When the gate had swung to behind me with a vicious click, I felt better, and after 10 minutes along the road it began to grow on me that some radical change was needed, that I was in a blind alley, and that this intolerable state of things must somehow cease. All that I could do, I had already done. As well-meaning a fellow as ever stepped was pounding along the road that day, with an exceeding sore heart, one who only wished to live and let live, in touch with his fellows and appreciating what joys life had to offer. What was wanted now was a complete change of environment. Somewhere in the world, I felt sure, justice and sympathy still resided. There were places called pampas, for instance, that sounded well. League upon league of grass, with just an occasional wild horse, and not a relation within the horizon. To a bruised spirit this seemed a sane and a healing sort of existence. There were other pleasant corners, again, where you dived for pearls and stabbed sharks in the stomach with your big knife. No relations would be likely to come interfering with you when thus blissfully occupied. And yet I did not wish, just yet, to have done with relations entirely. They should be made to feel their position first, to see themselves as they really were, and to wish, when it was too late, that they had behaved more properly. Of all professions, the army seemed to lend itself the most thoroughly to the scheme. You enlisted, you followed the drum, you marched, fought, and ported arms under strange skies through unrecorded years. At long last, your opportunity would come, when the horrors of war were flickering through the quiet countryside, where you were cradled and bred, but where the memory of you had long been dim. Folk would run together, clamorous, palsied with fear, and among the terror-stricken groups would feature certain ants. What hope is left us, they would ask themselves, save in the clemency of the general, the mysterious, invincible general, of whom men tell such romantic tales? And the army would march in, and the guns would rattle and leap along the village street, and last of all, you the general, the fabled hero, you would enter on your coal-black charger, your pale face set seamed by an interesting sabre cut. And then, but every boy has rehearsed this familiar piece a score of times. You are magnanimous, in fine, that goes without saying. You have a coal-black horse and a sabre-cut, and you can afford to be very magnanimous. But all the same you give them a good talking to. This pleasant conceit simply ravished my soul for some 20 minutes, and then the old sense of injury began to well up afresh, and to call for new plasters and soothing syrups. This time I took refuge in happy thoughts of the sea. The sea was my real sphere, after all. On the sea, in especial, you could combine distinction with lawlessness, whereas the army seemed to be always weighted by a certain plodding submission to discipline. To be sure, by all accounts, the life was at first a rough one, but just then I wanted to suffer keenly. I wanted to be a poor devil of a cabin boy, kicked, beaten, and sworn at for a time. Perhaps some hint, some inkling of my sufferings might reach their ears. In due course the sloop or felucca would turn up. It always did. The rakish-looking craft, black of hull, low in the water, and bristling with guns. The Jolly Roger flapping overhead, and myself for sole commander. By and by, as usually happened, an East Indiaman would come sailing along full of relations. Not a necessary relation would be missing. And the crew should walk the plank, and the captain should dance from his own yard-arm, and then I would take the passengers in hand, that miserable group of well-known figures cowering on the quarter-deck. And then the same old performance, the air thick with magnanimity. In all the repertory of heroes, none is more truly magnanimous than your pirate chief. When at last I brought myself back from the future to the actual present, I found that these delectable visions had helped me over a longer stretch of road than I had imagined, and I looked around and took my bearings. To the right of me was a long, low building of grey stone, new, and yet not smugly so. New and yet possessing distinction, marked with a character that did not depend on lichen or on crumbling semi-effacement of moulding and mullion. Strangers might have been puzzled to classify it. To me, an explorer from your earliest years, the place was familiar enough. Most folk called it the settlement. Others, with quite sufficient conciseness for our neighbourhood, spoke of them there fellows up at Halliday's. Others again, with a hint of derision, named them the monks. This last title I supposed to be intended for satire, and knew to be fatuously wrong. I was thoroughly acquainted with monks in books, and well knew the cut of their long frocks, their shaven poles, and their fascinating big dogs, with brandy bottles round their necks, incessantly hauling happy travellers out of the snow. The only dog at the settlement was an Irish terrier, and the good fellows who owned him, and were owned by him in common, wore clothes of the most nondescript order, and mostly cultivated side whiskers. I had wandered up there one day, searching, as usual, for something I had never found, and had been taken in by them, and treated as friend and comrade. They had made me free of their ideal little rooms, full of books and pictures, and clean of the anti-macassar taint. Don't know that word. They had shown me their chapel, high, hushed, and faintly scented, beautiful with a strange new beauty born both of what it had and what it had not. That too familiar dowdiness of common places of worship. They had also fed me in their dining hall, where a long table stood on trestles plain to view, and all the woodwork was natural, unpainted, healthily scrubbed, and redolent of the forest it came from. I brought away from that visit, and kept by me for many days, a sense of cleanness, of the freshness that pricks the senses, the freshness of cool spring water, and the large swept spaces of the rooms, the red tiles and the oaken settles, suggested a comfort that had no connection with padded upholstery. And with that we come to the end of the episode. So I will say thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon or night. No matter what time of day it is, I hope you all have a wonderful one of it. And as always, we will be back tomorrow for more of The Longing. Goodbye.